Hi, I'm glad that many of you are gathering today for the summit, and I'm sorry that I can't be there. This is the third year in a row that there has been a summit breakout session or workshop talking about Asian Americans, and I'm really glad about this development. Most of us don't get much of an education about the nearly 5.6 million estimated by the census Asians in America. And there's not a lot of popular culture, although that's changing. And this is a really diverse political category created largely during the civil rights movement when Asians found that because they were neither black nor white, that they weren't necessarily visible in the racial dynamic that really structures white supremacy in this country, which has been built on the oppression, particularly of people identified as black. And these racial categories have changed over time. They haven't stayed static, but the presence of Asians goes back centuries in the United States, and they were called by different groups, terms that we don't use today, and they really influenced the legal recognition of what is white and black in ways that people don't always know. The Asians are the fastest growing racial group in the United States. They are represented most by people with origins in China, the Philippines, and India. In Pittsburgh, there are large populations in the East End, especially in Squirrel Hill, and some sections of the South Hills. Bhutanese communities represent the largest refugee populations in Pittsburgh area, and they too are from Asia. But the stories you'll hear today, I wanted to give you a framework for recognizing them as part of the broader story of Asians in the United States. And this is based on research I did for a book that was published in 2011 by Temple University Press called How to Be South Asian in America, in which I talk about how Asian immigration has impacted especially opportunity and the American dream. The ways in which Asians have really been part of shaping racial history in the United States comes very dramatically from a Supreme Court case in the 1920s, Bhagat Singh Singh, who argued that because he was considered Caucasian by the law and science of the time, that he should be allowed to become a naturalized U.S. citizen. Now, these so-called race sciences of the early part of the 20th century have been debunked. They were based on very flimsy reasoning and no evidence to speak of. But they considered people to be divided into categories that had names such as Caucasoid and Mongoloid and Negroid. These terms that were used, and by those parameters, the complainant was correct that he would be considered white, and that was a prerequisite for citizenship in the United States. The Supreme Court acknowledged the validity of his claim that by law he should be allowed to be a citizen, but they allowed racism to instead determine their decision and argued that because the common person, meaning white citizen, would not consider this Indian immigrant to be a peer, that he would be denied citizenship. This helped to maintain a certain definition of whiteness. And as I said, these cases, while not known by many, really came at instrumental times to help reinforce the superiority and the access to rights such as voting and citizenship to particular people. The Asian American story is partly hard for folks to recognize and understand because there was a big gap in the 20th century when Asians were kept to strict quotas from immigrating. So between the 1880s and the 1960s, starting with the Chinese Exclusion Act, which at that time was the only act that barred a particular group of people from coming to the United States, quotas were kept very low and there were very few new Asian immigrants to the U.S. for a variety of political reasons, both to recognize allyship during World War II. And because of the need of workers and professionals in certain sectors, in 1965, immigration reform led to new waves of Asian immigrants coming to the U.S. These included nurses and engineers and doctors who were filling roles that were not being filled by people in the United States, and filling roles, for example, in healthcare, in rural and other areas where it was very hard to find American workers. So these later immigrant groups became defined according to a model minority myth, and it was used as a tool and a weapon to divide those who were non-white in the United States and to maintain this system of white supremacy, to blame racial groups, including African Americans and Latinx communities, for not being able to achieve the same kind of professional success, overlooking the fact that the Asian immigrants being pointed to often were in the country precisely because they already had those credentials and access to certain kinds of privileges. And that myth is harmful in general because it also obscures that in addition to the undocumented Asians who are coming in large numbers to the U.S., there are many Asians who live in poverty, experience housing and food insecurity, and who continue to face racial discrimination, both overt discrimination, as in systematic bans for those who might be Muslim from Asian countries, for those who are expected to conform, to adhere to certain kinds of ideas of whiteness, to prevent racial discrimination, who are not seen as real members of American culture. So Asians are often asked, where are you really from? In answer to that question, you're going to hear people telling their own stories, and I hope there's good conversation. Thank you for letting me participate remotely.